All right, well, let's look at verse 1 of chapter 12. It says this: About this time, King Herod arrested some who belonged to the church, intending to persecute them. He had James, the brother of John, put to death with the sword. I want to pause here for just a second, and I'm actually going to pause a few times throughout this video, and so you might want to write this down as I provide a little clarification. Now, you may be familiar with this name Herod. We read it throughout the Gospels and also here in Acts. It can get a little confusing though. Okay, is this the same guy? Are they family? What's the situation? And so I wanted to provide this help. Herod the Great was responsible for having all the babies killed around the time that Jesus was born. So at Christmas time, we're familiar with that story where the wise men come to visit Jesus. They leave to go back to their land, and Herod is so jealous that he has all these babies killed. And so that was Herod the Great. Herod Antipas, okay, so Herod Antipas, he was son of Herod the Great, and he had John the Baptist beheaded. And then we have Herod Agrippa I, whose uncle was Herod Antipas, and that's who we're reading about here. And then in Acts chapters 25 and 26, we'll read about his son, Agrippa II. So it gets a little confusing, but hopefully that helps some. But just know this, that this family was not good and was very evil when it came to God's people. In verse 2, we read that James, John's brother, was put to death. And so I also want to clarify this a little bit. This James here is James, one of the 12 disciples. We actually read about two men named James in the book of Acts. So this James here, again, is one of the 12 disciples, and he was the brother of John. And so this is the same John that wrote the Gospel of John, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and then the book of Revelation. Also, James, John, and Peter were part of the inner circle of Jesus. And so there were the 12 disciples, but these three made up Jesus's inner circle. So they were his closest friends. The other James that we're going to read about later on in this passage is actually Jesus's half-brother. He was a key leader in the early church, and he's the one that wrote the letter of James that we have in the New Testament. All right, so we got all that. Hopefully that helps some. So as we continue, we read about the death of James and how this pleased the Jews, and because of this, Herod had Peter arrested and put in prison. Look at verse 5. So Peter was kept in prison, but the church was earnestly praying to God for him. The night before Herod was to bring him to trial, Peter was sleeping between two soldiers, bound with two chains, and sentries stood guard at the entrance. And I love how Peter is about to be put on trial, which would most likely lead to his execution, and he's asleep. Peter is so confident in his faith that he can sleep between these guards. That's just amazing to me. And I think it's just a great example of how in any circumstance we can have extreme faith and confidence in the Lord. Well, an angel shows up and tries to wake Peter up, but Peter is so out of it, he actually just thinks he's having a vision. Look at verse 10. It says that's the angel and Peter, passed the first and second guards and came to the iron gate leading to the city. It opened for them by itself, and they went through it. When they had walked the length of one street, suddenly the angel left him. Look at verse 11. Then Peter came to himself and said, "Now I know without a doubt that the Lord has sent his angel and rescued me from Herod's clutches and from everything the Jewish people were hoping would happen." When this had dawned on him, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, also called Mark, where many people had gathered and were praying. And so again, I want to pause here for just a second and provide a little bit of clarification because I find this so fascinating. You'll notice in verse 12 that Peter goes to the house of Mary, and then it mentions this young man by the name of John, who's also called Mark. And this is the same Mark that would later write the Gospel of Mark. And what I love is that Mark had this close relationship with Peter, and when he wrote his gospel, much of it was from eyewitness testimony that he had heard from Peter. And so this gives me so much confidence that what we actually read in the Gospel of Mark took place because Peter had been with the Lord for 3 years, and he told this to Mark, who wrote it down. So after getting out of prison, Peter goes to this house where these believers had been praying for him. And Peter knocks on the door, and this lady named Rhoda, she comes to the door and recognizes Peter's voice, and she gets so excited that she doesn't open the door for him. Instead, she runs back in and tells the others that Peter is at the door. But what's funny is they don't believe her. Actually, they say that she's out of her mind. And so these believers, they've been praying, no doubt they were praying that Peter would be freed from the prison. Their prayer is answered, and yet they don't believe it. And this is a good word for us, that when we pray, no matter the circumstance, we can have confidence that if the Lord wills, He will answer that prayer. Look at verse 16. But Peter kept on knocking, and when they had opened the door and saw him, they were astonished. I think it's so funny that it was easier for Peter to get out of the jail than to get into this house. In verse 17, Peter motioned with his hand for them to be quiet and described how the Lord had brought him out of prison. And he says, tell James, this is James, the half-brother of Jesus, tell James and the other brothers and sisters about this, and then he left for another place. Now, as we get to the end of chapter 12, we see that Herod, this cruel leader who had James put to death and Peter arrested, ends up dying as part of God's judgment. Now remember, Acts is really volume 2. So volume 1 is the Gospel of Luke, and then Acts is really, again, volume 2. In Luke, he's a physician, he's a diligent historian, and he says in Luke 1 and also in Acts 1 that he is writing this as an eyewitness testimony. And this account of the death of Herod is a great example, as we also see the historian Josephus who recorded this event. Josephus wrote in his book titled Antiquities that Herod had this festival and he wore this silver robe that sparkled in the sun, and that the people basically began to exclaim that Herod was a god. And Herod gladly received this. But Josephus says this, that after this took place, Herod suddenly began to experience violent stomach pains, and 5 days later, he died, which is what we read in verse 21 here. It says, on the appointed day, Herod, wearing his royal robes, sat on his throne and delivered a public address to the people. They shouted, this is the voice of a God, not of a man. Immediately, because Herod did not give praise to God, an angel of the Lord struck him down, and he was eaten by worms and died. And so again, Luke is a historian, Josephus is a historian, and these two stories match up very well. So this is a great chapter, and one I hope you read again and keep on studying. But as we end our time together, I want to ask you a couple questions. So number one is this: how does Peter's faith encourage you today? As we noted, Peter is in prison, but he's asleep. He has this extreme confidence in the Lord. What's funny is the angel shows up, there's this bright light all around, and even that doesn't wake up Peter. The angel actually has to strike him on the side to get him to wake up. Now, it could be that maybe Peter's just a deep sleeper, but I don't think that's it. No, Peter again was so confident in his faith that no matter the circumstance, he trusted in the Lord, and he knew that the Lord would either free him if he wanted to or keep him there, but regardless, he was going to trust in the Lord's provision. And the second question is this: how does this passage encourage you to watch for answered prayer? We saw that these believers were praying for Peter, and when God answered their prayer, they couldn't believe it. Now, you ever pray like that? Maybe you've been praying for somebody to come to faith in the Lord, and praying for years and years, and then you finally hear that they put their faith in Jesus, and you just don't believe it. But we need to remember that the Lord answers prayer. But even if He doesn't answer it in the way that we want, again, we can have confidence that He has the best in mind for us, and that we can trust Him no matter the circumstance. Well, I hope you enjoyed chapter 12. We'll see you next week.